Hello, everyone. This is Ed Amoroso. I want to welcome you to our webinar discussion here. I'm looking very much forward to this discussion. We've got an amazing expert here, someone I've known a long time, the CEO of Security Compass, Rohit Sethi, who I think is one of the world's leading experts on kind of shifting left, on making sure that security teams are getting good return on the types of things they're doing during development, and also making sure that there's some business sense to the whole thing. Rohit, it's great to see you. How's everything going?
Likewise, thanks, Ed. I always enjoy talking with you.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna ask you to kind of be our tour guide. I know
Sure.
you have some really nice materials. I went through them. It's a great narrative. So maybe you can take us through the story. And I think those three themes would be things that people would be particularly interested in hearing about. I love how you guys push security by design. It's one of my favorite things in our industry. I think people get too depressed and they say, we can't stop security attacks, so just give up. And you
Yeah.
guys are one of the few companies that says, no, don't give up. I think we can make things better. So keep doing that. I think that's exactly the right message for teams. But why don't you, I know you've got a few visuals. Why don't you take us through some of the story? And as you go through it, I'm sure there'll be some questions I'll ask. I'll serve as the proxy for the audience here, and looking very much forward to the discussion.
Sounds good. Well, maybe I can start the stage a little bit. When we talk about security by design, we're really talking about integrating security in to the beginning of the development process. That's before you write code, although, for many applications, it's an ongoing thing. It's not just once, you're continuously as you iterate and continue to build new capabilities into software that you're making sure that it's continuously secure. And this is usually a very big mindset shift for most people who are used to thinking about security as a quality that you test for. Even the very concept of shift left, which is derived from the QA world, right? A lot of people equate that with testing security as early as possible to find a defect so you can fix it as soon as possible. And the idea that you should, in fact, be thinking about security before there is a defect is really a paradigm shift for most people. And it takes some convincing. I think those of us who live in security sometimes feel like it should be a no-brainer, right? Like everybody should want to do security by design because obviously you're going to have more secure systems and it's going to be cheaper to do it that way. But what happens is when you really try to productionize this and you get people to change their processes and that sort of thing, the mindset shift becomes a bit of a blocker, right? What we often find is people think, well, we already have, security testing and scanning activities. And so are you saying that we could scan earlier to find issues earlier? And then we talk about, no, we're really talking about integrating security in before there is an issue. So a preventative control that means there's not going to be an issue. Often people push back and say, sounds theoretical, right? Like, I don't want to worry about theoretical risks. I want to worry about real risks. And so I'm going to wait till the risks are identified, and that's where I'm going to spend my security time and effort. And so, unfortunately, you get the sort of circular reasoning where people feel like it doesn't make sense to focus on security by design. Let's wait till we find a defect and let's go and fix it because the concept is so foreign to them, right? And so we often talk a lot about how to roll out security by design and how to make sure that you have the right tooling support and people support and everything. But really, at the heart of it, for any of that to be successful, we really need people to buy into the concept, right?
Right.
And that's kind of building the business case. And so where we often, start the conversation with a prospective, company that we're going to work with is to talk about building the business case and thinking about it from a quantitative perspective. How can you show that doing this helps to move the business forward? And that's really what we like to
You've
talk about.
taught me that when we say mindset, me being Mr. Nerd, I always thought, well, developers, but you taught me it has to start at the senior executive level. It's a cultural shift from top to bottom. And I
Yeah.
remember thinking I didn't totally get that until we started going through some use cases, and it's right. The mindset has to be top to bottom. I think that's maybe why it's been tough in the past. Like if I had to
Yeah.
guess, most developers listening to this are going, yeah, I get it. but most executives don't. They've been sort of taught that problems are inevitable. Just load up on the backup and response, and and slog through the development, and whatever happens happens. And you and I know that's not the right approach. That's not how good engineering works. But that mindset from top to bottom, that's new, and that's harder than just convincing developers. Usually that's
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that's something that once upon a time, I'd say it was optional. People could kind of choose to buy into that or not. And I think, what's interesting now is we're starting to see that change. The shift is starting to happen where it's not like I can choose to believe in security by design or not. Right now, what we're and I'll just I'll share something here. Well, now what we're starting to see is that security by design is becoming required, right?
Mm.
And I really think what catalyzed this is a couple of years ago, the executive order on software supply chain sort of opened people's eyes to how important security in software is to the entire ecosystem. People create a vulnerable application, it becomes a CVE that someone has to patch, and then they have to respond to, and then they have the whole almost the entire chain of cybersecurity has to respond as a result of this the defect that's in software. And so it became, it took a long time. I don't know why it took so long, but it became a hot button issue at the highest level. I think we have a problem here. I think we need more secure software from the beginning. And so then, what started to happen after that, especially last year, was a number of countries started to all chime in. And so you'll see in the slide the secure by design white paper from CISA, but in fact several countries all contributed to the white paper, making sure that security is baked into software and it's the default, and really pushing that agenda forward. And I'd say it kind of began with the concept of being a guideline or like a suggestion to product manufacturers. And so this was useful for people to read, but it wasn't necessarily something that was a must have. But then what started to happen was, we'd see standards and laws following this change. The first one, the executive order that I mentioned, catalyzed some changes to the government acquisition process. The U.S. federal government, if you're selling software to the government, in fact, now there is a push to make sure that you're integrating security into the development process, and that has become law, which is it's a huge step, right? Like it's really never happened before that you must follow secure, development practices to sell into the government. And then now we've started to see the EU take that even one step further with the Cyber Resilience Act, which is introducing mandatory cybersecurity requirements beyond just selling to the government, but selling to consumers in the EU. We see the cyber trust mark in the US as a proposed program, which again is going to require people who are selling products, IoT products, to ensure that they've integrated security controls in. A lot of the industries, medical devices, the payment card industry, the industrial control systems, they all have kind of jumped on and started to introduce controls specifically to secure software development, including integrating security in by design. And just this week, NIST released the update to their cybersecurity framework. And, this is probably one of the most important frameworks. And you would know this, Ed, right? Like, so the CSF is the standard, right? For so many companies at the executive and the board level to monitor the progress of cybersecurity. And up until this version, there was really no specific mention of secure software development, right? But this version introduced a new category on platform security and specifically called out secure software development practices. And so now something that, again, maybe didn't make the cut of being a must-have, right? Because it wasn't aligned with the frameworks that large organizations were using to assess their security posture. That's begun to change.
The language there in CSF 2.0 and also CRA from the EU, It looked like that could have been written by your marketing department. I mean, those are statements of what you guys believe in. And I thought about you as I saw
Yeah,
that those changes, but it's kind of natural. I think it alluded to a lot of these things in their earlier framework, but it wasn't
that's
as
right.
explicit. I've done
Yeah.
so many mappings to NIST that it was always things that we emphasized, but now it's very clear. So that's good for you guys and also good for our community because let's face it, I think we've underestimated the benefit. Forget about avoiding problems, but just flat out the benefit in terms of return and in terms of just making business sense of being a little bit more attentive to security by design. I'm glad you guys are doing that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the impetus often has to come from, as the life of a CISO or CSO is there's a million things that they could be focusing on. Often when you're starting to build a security program, you got to start from somewhere. These frameworks and laws, ultimately, maybe they weren't designed necessarily to be the roadmap on everything you should focus on, but they have that sort of impact on a lot of companies where it's, let's look at a framework and let's make that the minimum standard that we're going to achieve. And so it's really driving things that, like I said, were sort of, optional, like secure SDLC, and turning them into something that's now increasingly becoming mandatory.
Very much concur.
So, you know, one of the things that we're starting to see, as we go and survey industry, in 2021, when we talked about shifting security left, integrating security in earlier in the development process, it was important. And so maybe just over half of people would think of it as one of their top 10 priorities, or say top 3 priorities. But it's a really dramatic shift, right? If you look at those two stats in 2023,
Amen.
90%.
Amen. Thank goodness. Yeah, it's going the right direction.
So it's clearly, that message is being received by development teams and by the business that we need to integrate security earlier. And so that's a good concept. At the flip side, though, what we're finding is that 74% of developers are engaging with security after the design phase. So it's interesting. It's a top priority. It's required by all these standards and laws. But still, when it comes to what's happening in practice, most developers think of security after the design phase. And I think it goes back to this whole mindset shift I talked about, that, security is a thing that you test for. And so like when, for example, we're starting to think about the provisioning of, time as product managers allocate how much time people should spend on things. And, often development teams are behind on what they need to deliver from a functionality standpoint. If you think of security as being a thing that ought to be tested, then you're not going to spend those precious early cycles on security. You're going to focus on making sure that you get the functionality out of the way. And then when there's time left at the end, you're reaching out to security to make sure that you get the rubber stamp before you release, right? And so that's what's still, unfortunately, too common of a practice. Now, what we have seen is that when we have customers who do really measure the benefit of security by design, and this is from a customer that did this. It's a few years old in terms of the number of vulnerabilities. Probably these days people are building more secure software, but we'll often see, on average, several high risk vulnerabilities and medium risk vulnerabilities in an application throughout the year. So in this case, this was the average of what they saw, off a set of applications in a year. And then they did a control set where they integrated security in by design. And they had no high risk vulnerabilities and 0.4 medium risk vulnerabilities. And those numbers might seem outlandish, but if you think about it, most of the things that people find in penetration tests and static analysis, they're all vulnerabilities we've known about for a really long time, and they're all quite preventable. And so if you equip people with the knowledge and tools they need to integrate security in by design, they in fact can prevent them, right? And
Yes.
you can have really, really dramatic results.
Let's connect this quickly because we were saying executive from the executive level down. For folks listening who might be CISOs,
Yeah.
The difference between the left and the right in the context of SEC reporting for public companies is a big deal.
Yeah.
Because my fear is that we're starting to move from reporting around incidents to reporting around vulnerabilities. Like I kind of hope that doesn't happen. I don't think CISO should have to report vulnerabilities to the government, as opposed to incidents, but I think we're on a collision course with that. What
Mm,
that means is two things. One is you're going to be reporting a lot, and number two, you better focus a lot more time on avoiding vulnerabilities. It can't just be let them happen and be good at responding, because that's
yeah.
going to be a lot of hot water in your reporting. So if anything, for public companies, just turn the notch a couple of degrees. If you can't completely change the culture, just
Right.
focus a little bit more on avoidance. And I think it's going to pay spectacular dividends. Rohit, think about how much money is spent when you have to deal with an incident that's reportable. I mean, the numbers can be in the millions, right?
Yeah.
When you go, so I can't think of a better case of, being penny wise, pound foolish when you don't make that investment up front. I mean, you and I are both engineers, so we know that it makes really good sense. It's just people, I think they're rushed. Like if you ask me my root cause on why people do things without security by design, it's because they're rushed. So,
Yeah.
maybe executive teams allow people the time to do it right. It's going to save you a lot of trouble on the back end.
For sure. And in fact, so I think what's worth delving into a little bit now is how do we get the executives to buy in, right? How do you get them to understand that this is the right thing
Wave
to do?
the SEC thing at them and they'll buy
That
it.
helps. That helps. I mean, the thing we always run into with cybersecurity is probably every part of the cybersecurity program is waving the SEC thing and saying you should fund this, you should focus on it. So I mean, to be fair, it is driving a lot of interest when we talk to industry analysts,
Because you're in the
like yourself.
crosshairs. I mean,
Yeah,
this is what you're saying. You are of any organization I've seen or any of the vendors. This is the message that resonates the most with me.
yeah,
Like it's, you have to report every disease, then don't just get good at reporting diseases. How about stop the diseases?
that's
That's
right. It's good. It's a good way to put
it's
it.
pretty natural to me, but
Yeah.
sometimes it has to be pushed right in your face to get it.
So what we found over the years, having worked with many companies to roll out security by design, is that there are people who do it spectacularly, and then there are failures. And regardless of what you might see here as great results, the reality is it takes a lot of work to get to those great results because I mentioned like the cultural change that's necessary. So over the years, what we found is that there are four really common anti-patterns, right? Things that we see as themes that if you don't do the right activities and you get into the trap of having one of these anti-patterns, they could throw the whole thing off. And in fact, the entire program fails. So usually what will happen is people will throw it out and say, we're going to go back to how things were. And we're going to accept whatever risk that comes with it. And I'm not going to go into the details of all four of these because they're all maybe their own webinar. But the four that we talk about are the silo, which is managing security by design as a security only initiative, the scorecard, which is not measuring proactive metrics, the tidal wave, forcing a lot of change quickly, and then the bottleneck, which is security being the thing that slows down the business. If you don't pay attention to these four anti-patterns, then what often happens is you might start to get some traction. Maybe you have a really good pilot result, but things fall flat. People stop adopting the tools, processes, techniques they need to, integrate security by design. What I really want to hammer in on today is the silo and the scorecard, right? So the silo, like we just talked about, meaning that security by design cannot be something that just cybersecurity owns. And what's really interesting, I think, is that this is also a mindset shift for a lot of companies. When they first introduce application security, they think of security as a gating process, right? So we're going to take software development and we're going to add this check that says, if you meet some minimum threshold for security, for example, you have no high risk vulnerabilities, then you're allowed to deploy it into production. And if you don't, then you're not allowed, right? Quite simple. Um, what happens though is that oftentimes we'll see them try to adopt that same sort of mentality when they apply security by design. So security owns the entire thing. There's no buy-in from the development teams. They interject a new step, but now they try to do it earlier in the development process and say, you got to do a threat model or you got to integrate security requirements. But it's very different because there's no gating process, right? There is no, you have met a minimum threshold of risk. And so what will often happen is development teams just won't do it, and they'll wait till the vulnerabilities are discovered, and they're going to spend all their time on fixing vulnerabilities. So again, to make sure that doesn't happen, we need to have the right buy-in before you launch the program. And that goes hand in hand with the ways you measure the program. How are we benefiting the business? And how are we going to make sure that we are continuously measuring that to show what kind of benefit there is to the business? And also where there are people who maybe aren't following the security by design practices, so that it doesn't become a nice to have and it becomes something that becomes part of the culture of the company.
And the units of that quantification don't have to be like fewer vulnerabilities. It can be dollars, like actually
That's right.
money, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
That's like essentially ensuring some business friendly usage and terminology. It allows you to really connect up from top to bottom. If you say, I went from 83, you know how we developers, I went from 83,000 vulnerabilities to 26. It's just, like nobody knows what that means. It's
Yeah.
just kind of crazy. But if you're really showing the impact on the business in terms they can understand, that it changes the game.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I like to do is challenge people when they say, I want to roll out threat modeling or I want to integrate security requirements. Why are you doing it?
Yeah.
And we'll often hear things like, I want to get ahead of vulnerabilities, or it's a best practice and we just ought to do it, right? That sort of thing. And I, I guess push a little bit harder and say, but what
Right.
if you didn't do it?
Yeah.
Right? What is the impact? And so really what we found is that there's four key themes that come out. What are the four business drivers, the four things that really matter to the business? So if you're talking to the CFO to justify why you're going to launch this program, that they could understand, as opposed to just talking amongst technical stakeholders, right?
Right.
And the first is to reduce cost, right?
Yeah.
To your point, we could do things cheaper than we are today. We can lower total spend on security. The second is to reduce risk, right? Which is, we have vulnerabilities and they're going into production that leaves us at risk today. And we could have fewer of those so that we have less opportunity for a breach, right? The third is scalability, right? Which is to say, if you have security people who are somehow involved in the development process, but you don't have enough of them, which is often the case, right? Then they create this bottleneck. And so if you have to wait till you have passed some kind of security assessment or review or process, then you're inherently slowing down time to market, right? And so the question is, how can you make sure that you have integrated security in without slowing down time to market? And so the faster you can do it, right, the faster you get your functionality out to your end users. And so that's another major business driver. And the last one that we see, which doesn't apply to everybody, but particularly applies to product manufacturers, people who sell software itself or hardware or devices that have software on them, is revenue, right? Which is basically, how do you grow revenue? By demonstrating compliance to some minimum standard, right? And in some cases, that is a industry specific standard, like in the industrial control space, ISA 62443, or in the medical devices space, the FDA regulation of cybersecurity. And increasingly, I believe the EU CRA, like you said, as well as the federal government in the US,
Yeah.
having new standards, right? So if you can comply with these things, what does that open up for you from the perspective of revenue? And these are the things that matter to the business.
Those are the right drivers. I think on risk, it's both business risk and, as we alluded earlier, it's also personal risk for
Sure.
executives. So there's many dimensions there of of improvement and business impact, which is good. Again, I love how you're tying together both the tech themes, that frankly, people like me are more comfortable with
Yeah,
the business themes that a board and a senior executive team are going to understand. I think that's so powerful and rare. I'm
yeah.
glad you're doing it. I'm terrible at doing that, but I'm glad you guys are doing it.
Well, it takes a lot of trial and error, let's say. It's not something that we're inherently good at either. It took time and it took a lot of examples of seeing how our customers talked about it. So, if we start with cost savings, which is like the sort of most crystal clear dollar benefit, um, we have some data. And what we found is that this has been really, really helpful for people is to talk about some industry average data. So we have the benefit of having worked with many, many companies over the years and being able to collect some metrics and aggregate those metrics together to come up with industry data. Now, these numbers could differ, right? You could have a company that has a very different number to any of these, and that's okay. You can always, you know, substitute in whatever data you have. But assuming you don't, assuming, for example, you don't know the cost to fix a critical or high risk vulnerability, the good news is lots of companies have measured it, and we've come up with an average, which is $10,630. Now, this is North America, North American enterprises typically, but that's typically the cost. And that might seem like a high number to some folks, especially in the era of DevOps. But the thing to remember is that some vulnerabilities are easy to fix and they don't take much time, but others are systematic and architectural. And so, in fact, it requires a lot of time for the developers to go and make all the corresponding changes and for it to be promoted up through production.
No,
Right.
it's
So
good. And averages are tough because sometimes a vulnerability will blow your numbers out of the water, like
that's
once
right.
a significant consequence. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm guessing this probably that like a median probably looks right, but for some companies, these numbers are going to be way higher because all
Yeah.
you need is one
Yeah.
that just knocks the business out, and that'll then averages don't even make sense. So I think you're being very conservative here. But it's a point is well taken, and it's a conservative number, but for larger companies, certainly you could probably add a zero in some of those cases.
Yeah, you probably could. That's right. So to the extent that you have your own data, of course, substitute that in. So if you have, and I think it's really well worth it if you're going to launch a security by design program, is know how much you are spending on fixing vulnerabilities, because that will make a big difference to justify. Like if it costs you $1 to fix a critical or high risk vulnerability on average, then this whole thing may be moot for most companies. They just be like, we're going to find them, we're going to fix them, and it's very cheap to do so. The
I
reality
like
is that's
start there. Tell me where that place is. That's good.
I personally don't think that's ever possible, but who knows, right? Who knows?
But if it's
Uh,
there, let me know. I'll send a resume over there. That's
yeah, that's right. So if you take the average cost to fix a vulnerability and you multiply it by the average number of critical and high risk vulnerabilities per application per year, right? Which is what what our data suggests, 6. Again, your numbers may be different. If you're very mature, that number might be lower. If you're not,
depend
it
on
might
the
be higher.
size and scope of the company, right?
Right.
That's certainly.
All these things are quite variable. But what we want to do is offer starting points, industry averages that you can pick and choose. And now the third one is more of an estimate. It's estimated number of vulnerabilities prevented by security by design. Now remember, in the example I showed you, that pilot, they reduced 100% of critical and high risk vulnerabilities. But to be slightly conservative, again, we will often talk about a number closer to 80%, assuming there are some applications that have vulnerabilities that even if you took all the best practices in the world, you wouldn't have prevented, or they were too difficult to prevent and they slipped through the cracks, right? But I would say 80% is a conservative estimate in terms of how many you can reduce. And so if you multiply those three numbers together, you have the estimated remediation savings. So you're spending $51,024 on remediation on the average application. And so therefore, security by design can save that much. Now you multiply that by the number of applications that you're, rolling this program out to, and you can start to see how the cost benefit becomes massive.
Good ROI.
Yep. So here's an example. Now this is a little more all encompassing, not just on what we talked about, but where we had an organization that really, looked at the cost savings not just with vulnerability remediation, but also spending less time on manual work from a security perspective. So they used to generate security requirements on their own. They started to automate that. They spent less time on audits and certifications because they had the automation to do it. And then they had increased productivity. Developers could spend less time, not just on remediation, but now they could, the opportunity cost became clear. They had increased productivity, which meant that they could, in fact, uplift revenue. And so in this particular case, it was a slam dunk in terms of quantified benefits. So it's just one example of how an organization looked at multiple routes to ROI from security by design. And we talked about risk reduction. And risk reduction is always a little tricky because lots of people have different ways to measure risk. I'm a big proponent of things like fair, quantified risk management. If you can get there, we have found in practice people are still, I guess, working their way to getting the
Good
expertise and
idea to
knowledge to do
get
it.
to dollars at some point.
Yeah.
Fair is adopted. I would say when we deal with enterprise teams, a majority of companies do like fair. Some don't, but
Yeah.
it is, everybody agrees getting to dollars is a good idea.
Right. So I would just caveat to say that would be ideal. If you don't have it though, and let's just say, you're starting from a little bit more of a less mature way of measuring risk,
Right.
a very simple way to quantify the risk reduction of security by design is to take the number of high and critical risk vulnerabilities you have per application, and then multiply it by the mean time to remediate critical risk vulnerabilities. So this we took from edge scan vulnerability statistic report, 65 days. So typically your average vulnerability is out in production 65 days, critical risk vulnerability. And so if you multiply those two numbers together, this is the sum, or the product, I should say, of the total window of risk, right? You have essentially 390 days. Not that's obviously not, it's more than a
Volume,
year.
not a timeline, it's a volume that you're
That's right.
looking
It's a volume of how to measure vulnerabilities. And so if you could bring that number down, you can understand how you're going to reduce risk, right? So again, if you can reduce 6 critical high risk vulnerabilities in your application, and each one is 65 days of exposure, you're reducing your exposure by 390 days. So again, a couple of industry stats.
It's a happiness improvement. I'll have happier days.
Yes, that's right. It's just the easier way to explain to, again, a
No, I
non-security.
like the volume of days is right. That's the way
Yeah.
a practitioner would think about this for sure.
And I find that MTTR is one of those metrics that people do tend to have, right? Like it's more commonly measured
I always
than
use
the
them.
other ones. Yeah.
Yep.
And this is just another data point to think about when you're writing, business case. The IBM did an analysis on a whole bunch of factors with relation to the cost of a breach. And what's really interesting was that DevSecOps brought the cost of the breach down by $250,000, the highest yield on average out of everything that you
Wow.
see here.
That looks
So incredible, right? So that must mean something about the effectiveness of adopting a DevSecOps approach and integrating security in throughout the process.
not a super controversial point. I think it's good. Yeah.
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 So, when we think about these things together, what it does is allows us to go back to the business and talk about, we got regulatory compliance coming in, making this stuff, mandatory, the SEC reporting requirements, which now, we've got to be a little more transparent about everything that happens in the business. And so we really have to double down on making sure we have less to report on. And then translating things like, vulnerabilities into how much cost and how much risk does that mean to the business. And these are really the starting points to help to craft a really good business case for executives, right? And then like, let's say you get past that point, you get the executive level buy-in. I talked about the scorecard as the other anti-pattern that's related here, which is, it's one thing to have the executive buy-in. It's another thing to make sure people are appropriately incented to spend the time on security by design. And so again, what we'll often see is that after getting that buy-in, people go back to their regular day-to-day work and they measure security only in vulnerabilities, right? So remember I mentioned that mindset shift we talked about at the beginning. If you measure security only in vulnerabilities, right, and that's the only scorecard that you use. So for example, how many vulnerabilities are in this application, mean time to remediate, et cetera, and that's all you use. What it unfortunately does is creates a bit of a disincentive to start to invest in security by design activities, because ultimately the number of vulnerabilities should go down and the mean time to remediate should go down, but it takes time to get there, right? So for example, when you first start with adopting security requirements or threat modeling, you're spending time analyzing the design, identifying what requirements are, necessary for an application, and then you're taking time to, to implement those requirements. And that could take weeks, months, years, depends on, where you're starting from and how exhaustive those requirements are. And if you're asking people to invest that time, and it's going to take those weeks, months, or years before the risk profile goes down, right? And there's no visible metric of any kind, no benchmark that rewards them for doing that work, then you have this conflict of interest, really, right? Where you're asking them to do things that will ultimately pay off, but they're not paying off right now. And so what we talk about is making sure that you can add preventative and proactive metrics. For example, proactive compliance. How many of the security relevant compliance and security and compliance controls and requirements have been implemented, right? What's the percentage? Another way to do that is to take the set of them and show a burn down, just like you do for a regular burn down in a Scrum process. How are you making progress on your security controls? Another thing to measure is how many applications could your security architect serve? So that's going back to the sort of scalability. These are all proactive metrics. And if you add them to your KPIs, OKRs, et cetera, and you're making sure that you're measuring them alongside the vulnerabilities, and you're setting yourself up to make sure that people are appropriately incented to spend time on security by design activities. If you don't, then you're going to run into the challenge, like I said before, where people are, investing time into something that's not going to immediately pay back for them.
Very rational.
So, without kind of belaboring the point, then you could take those things that we just talked about and you can come back to the business value. So now you can start to prove that over time you have, you are establishing and you're fulfilling the promise of security by design. So if you think about proactive compliance, for example, let's say you've implemented 75% of the controls. Well, you multiply that by the average number of vulnerabilities and how many of those vulnerabilities we prevented by security by design. And then you could estimate that we've prevented, say, 3.6 vulnerabilities if we were at 75%. And you take that number of estimated vulnerabilities, you multiply it by the cost to fix a vulnerability, and you could say right now, we have estimated that we've, saved $38,628 in remediation. Or you could multiply it by the MTTR per vulnerability, and you could say, right now, we believe that we've reduced the window of risk by 234 days, right? So you could go back to the business value and say, this is how we are making progress on those things we talked about in the business case.
That sure looks good to me. That's a good return.
And just to kind of cap things off, we talked about these metrics. We talk about the 3E framework for security by design. So that's basically in order to get past the cultural change that's required to truly roll out security by design, you've got to start with baseline education, which is training for development teams, but also the executive business case that we talked about, right? That's all education. That's getting people to understand why you are, spending this time on security by design. Once you've got it, you can then, focus on embedding. And that means integrating security expertise into the development teams. So security champions, for example. And then finally, empowering the development teams to really drive security by design. You've made more progress on your cultural change. People are starting to understand how and why you should do security by design. And that's the time to really equip them, to give them a platform to self-service and
Right.
effectively, really realize those benefits from an ROI
Your
perspective.
your team had shown our group at TAG this 3E framework. We loved it. I think I've stolen from it a couple of times. I think
Nice.
it's a good integrated way of thinking about how to actually translate what we've been talking about into action. So it's good.
That's right. Yep. So
Well,
that's kind of the framework on how we think about those really key issues about measuring ROI, building a business case, and making sure that you're tracking towards it, which are really critical in establishing a security by design program.
well, I'm a college professor, so I'm going to give you a grade. I think it's an A. I think it's
Thank
a
you.
really nice piece. I mean, the thing I love so much is that it does play into the right types of themes that we should be pushing, this prevention. So keep up the good work. I think it's awesome. If people are interested in more, what's the best way for them to be in touch with you guys? Would it be through your website?
That's right. Yeah. Check out the website. You can learn more about what we do, what we offer, and you can get in contact with us, and we're happy to talk more.
I hope they do. I really appreciated it. Thank you for sharing with me. I always feel like I should get some continuing education credits here. Email me a certificate afterwards that I've
I'll
taken.
see what I can do. Yeah.
That's what I need. They're really wonderful. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate you including me in the discussion.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Ed.
Wonderful. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thanks for joining our discussion today.
Thank you.